Berlin, 1933. Crowds flood the streets not out of fear, but faith. Men raise their hands, not under the gun, but under the illusion of unity. A failed artist, once ignored and ridiculed, now speaks, and millions obey. This wasn't magic, nor madness. It was a calculated manipulation of human emotion, a psychological machine built to enslave minds long before it sent bodies to war. Fact 1. The illusion of salvation. When Hitler first appeared on the national stage, Germany was a nation suffocating under humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed its pride, its economy lay in ruins, and its people felt abandoned by the world. Into this chaos stepped a man who did not simply offer solutions, he offered meaning. His speeches didn't begin with policy but with pain. He mirrored the despair of his audience, repeating their fears, their anger, their hopelessness, and then quietly replaced their shame with a sense of destiny. This was the first and most powerful trick, transforming national trauma into collective faith. Psychologists call it identification through projection. By reflecting the emotions of the masses, he made them believe he understood them, when in truth he was training them to follow. When Hitler shouted, "Germany will rise again," it wasn't a promise, it was hypnosis disguised as hope. Crowds that once felt invisible now believed they were chosen. Each rally was designed to deepen that illusion. The torchlight parades, the banners, the music, they weren't political events, they were rituals. Every uniform, every chant, every synchronized salute served one purpose: to dissolve individuality. The man on the stage became the mirror through which millions saw themselves reborn. Behind the grand speeches and emotional crescendos, his team of propagandists, Joseph Goebbels above all, understood the secret language of human psychology: repetition, rhythm, and emotional contagion. Hitler's pauses, his rising tone, the calculated silence before each outburst, all were rehearsed to induce a trance-like state. In that state, reason ceased to function. The crowd did not think, it felt. By the time the cheering stopped, they were no longer an audience. They were a congregation. And Hitler, no longer a politician, had become their prophet. The illusion was perfect because it exploited the oldest human need of all: the need to belong to something greater than ourselves. It was not hatred that first bound millions to him. It was hope. And that made the deception unstoppable until it was too late to wake from it. Fact 2. The enemy within. Every dictatorship begins with a promise of safety. Hitler's genius and his cruelty was in understanding that fear unites people faster than hope ever could. Once the illusion of salvation had bound the nation to him, he needed something to keep it that way: a constant threat, an invisible enemy to justify obedience. The Germany of the 1930s was restless and broken. Millions were unemployed. The streets were filled with rival political groups, each blaming someone else for the misery. Hitler took that chaos and gave it a face: the enemy within. Jews, communists, intellectuals, liberals, all were painted as traitors secretly conspiring to destroy the nation from the inside. It was a psychological masterpiece of projection. He accused others of what he himself planned to do. In speeches, he used simple contrasts: we versus they, pure versus corrupt, German versus foreign. Every phrase was designed to evoke disgust and moral superiority. When he spoke of cleansing the nation, he was not merely addressing politics, he was shaping emotion, teaching millions to feel hatred as virtue. This manipulation tapped into a primal human instinct: the need for order, the fear of contamination. Once that fear was lit, it burned reason to ash. Propaganda films, newspapers, and children's books followed the same rhythm. They didn't argue. They repeated. They used images of disease, decay, and invasion, imprinting the message not in the mind, but in the gut. Psychologists later called it emotional conditioning. When a person hears the same association, Jew equals danger, communist equals chaos, enough times it bypasses logic entirely. It becomes reflex. By the mid-1930s, this reflex defined every aspect of life. A teacher who questioned the party became suspect. A neighbor who didn't hang the flag might be reported. Citizens learned to police one another because fear had become moral duty. The people no longer needed to be forced. They believed. And belief, Hitler knew, was far more powerful than coercion. Through this psychological architecture of paranoia, Hitler turned civilians into informants and informants into accomplices. The result was a nation that persecuted its own conscience in the name of purity. When the first camps opened, few protested. Most thought they were necessary. That was the final triumph of the enemy within, not just to destroy others, but to destroy empathy itself. Fact 3. The theater of power. Hitler understood something most politicians never do, that power isn't only exercised, it's performed. Every gesture, every silence, every carefully choreographed scene was part of a vast psychological theater designed to make obedience feel natural and inevitable. From the moment he seized power in 1933, Germany became his stage. Rallies weren't meetings, they were spectacles. Albert Speer, his chief architect, transformed open fields into cathedrals of light. At Nuremberg, hundreds of floodlights pointed upward into the night sky, creating what was called the Cathedral of Light. It wasn't merely decoration, it was ritual. Ordinary citizens looked up and felt small beneath the blinding glow, consumed by something larger than themselves. That sensation, awe mixed with fear, was the emotional glue of totalitarianism. Hitler appeared on elevated platforms, always above his followers, framed by the swastika, a symbol chosen not just for ideology, but for geometry. Its sharp, rotating lines were meant to evoke motion and destiny. Behind him, banners the height of buildings rippled in perfect symmetry. Every camera angle was planned to make him appear as the axis around which the world revolved. Even the uniforms were psychological tools. Identical colors, polished boots, and rhythmic marches erased individuality and replaced it with unity. Joseph Goebbels, the master propagandist, called it emotional architecture. The idea was simple. Overwhelm the senses until doubt disappears. Music thundered before Hitler appeared. The crowd waited in silence until his voice cut through, soft at first, then rising, like a storm breaking. The rhythm of his speech matched the rhythm of the drums. By the time he shouted, the audience's breathing had synchronized with his. Those moments of spectacle weren't spontaneous. They were rehearsed like a sacred ceremony. Hitler's team tested how long the crowd should wait before he entered, how lighting should shift when he raised his hand, how the microphone should distort his voice slightly to give it echo, as if it were coming from the heavens. To the people below, this wasn't politics, it was revelation. And that was the point. The more divine he appeared, the less human he seemed, and the less human his crimes would feel. The theater of power made the unthinkable acceptable by cloaking it in beauty, rhythm, and ceremony. By the late 1930s, entire generations had been trained to associate pageantry with truth, obedience with virtue, and spectacle with salvation. Hitler didn't simply rule Germany. He directed it like a film, and his masterpiece was belief itself. Fact 4. Repetition as religion. No empire of lies can survive without rhythm. Hitler understood that words, repeated often enough, cease to be arguments, they become prayers. From the earliest days of his rise, he wielded repetition like a weapon, turning propaganda into a form of worship. In Nazi Germany, truth was not decided by evidence, but by echo. The same slogans appeared on every wall, every poster, every classroom banner. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one nation, one leader. It was a phrase designed not to inform, but to hypnotize. Its cadence was perfect, its simplicity disarming. It didn't invite thought, it replaced it. Over time, it no longer meant anything concrete. It simply felt right. And that was precisely the point. Psychologists would later call this illusory truth effect, the tendency of the human mind to believe something after hearing it again and again. Hitler and Goebbels didn't need to convince people. They only needed to exhaust them into agreement. Repetition dulled skepticism and replaced it with emotional comfort. It made the extraordinary seem ordinary, the brutal sound reasonable, the lie feel familiar. Every medium was enlisted in this assault on independent thought. Newspapers carried identical headlines. Radio speeches replayed the same phrases across the nation. Even children's songs echoed the same themes: purity, loyalty, destiny. The words burrowed into daily life until they no longer sounded political at all. They became the background noise of existence, a kind of national heartbeat. Inside schools, teachers drilled the same sentences into young minds, blending ideology with grammar lessons. A child who learned to spell the word Führer also learned to revere it. In factories, workers began their shifts with chants. Bureaucrats signed letters ending with Heil Hitler, not as belief, but as habit. And habit, Hitler knew, was stronger than fear. By erasing variety in language, he erased variety in thought. The German vocabulary itself was narrowed. Words like freedom, democracy, and conscience quietly disappeared from everyday speech. People who no longer had words for dissent soon lost the ability to imagine it. What made this psychological trick so devastating was its subtlety. No one ordered the population to believe. They simply learned to repeat. And repetition, whispered long enough, becomes truth. By 1939, millions could recite entire passages from Hitler's speeches, yet few could explain them. It didn't matter. Meaning was irrelevant. The rhythm was everything. The Führer had transformed language, humanity's tool for thinking, into the architecture of obedience. Fact 5. The manufactured Messiah. Every tyranny needs a god, and Hitler chose to become his own. From the earliest days of his rise, he built not just a political movement, but a religion of himself. The party became the church, the rallies its rituals, and the Führer its living deity. This was not accidental. It was the result of meticulous psychological engineering, a system designed to satisfy Germany's spiritual hunger after its political collapse. In the 1920s, millions of Germans felt abandoned by traditional institutions. The monarchy was gone, the economy shattered, the church silent. Hitler filled that vacuum with a new faith, one that demanded not prayer, but surrender. His speeches echoed with quasi-religious phrases. Providence has chosen me. I follow the will of destiny. The more he invoked fate, the more his followers believed that opposing him was not just treason, it was heresy. Joseph Goebbels crafted the myth of divine guidance. Newspapers described Hitler as the instrument of fate. Painters depicted him with light shining over his head. Films showed him emerging from crowds like a prophet stepping out of chaos. Every visual detail, the white gloves, the upward gaze, the carefully timed silence before speaking, was rehearsed to evoke reverence. He wasn't selling politics. He was selling transcendence. Hitler's team even rewrote his personal history to fit the myth. His failed years as an artist in Vienna were recast as a pilgrimage through hardship. His survival in World War I, a miracle. His imprisonment after the beer hall putsch, a revelation. Mein Kampf became his scripture, a sacred text written in solitude by the chosen one. Photographers were instructed to never show him eating, smoking, or relaxing. The public would see him only as a figure of purpose and destiny, untouched by ordinary weakness. The structure of Nazi propaganda mirrored that of a faith. Creed, Germany above all. Messiah, the Führer who would redeem the nation. Saints, fallen soldiers and party martyrs, honored like apostles. Devil, the Jews, the communists, the foreign conspirators. By giving moral shape to hatred, Hitler sanctified it. The people no longer saw their actions as cruelty. They saw them as service. Parades resembled pilgrimages. Portraits of Hitler replaced crucifixes in homes. To millions, obedience became salvation. This deification of one man was the ultimate psychological trap. The more godlike Hitler appeared, the less accountable he became. When the war turned disastrous, faith only deepened. People did not doubt him. They doubted themselves. "He cannot be wrong," one woman wrote in her diary in 1944. "We must be the ones failing him." By the time the bombs fell on Berlin, the cult had fulfilled its purpose. Hitler had become an object of worship powerful enough to blind a nation. Proof that when politics adopts the language of divinity, evil can march under the banner of faith. Fact 6. The indoctrination of innocence. The most terrifying aspect of Hitler's control was not how he conquered minds, but when he began doing it. He understood a truth as old as tyranny itself. Adults may doubt, but children believe. If he could shape the next generation before they learned to question, his Reich would endure long after he was gone. Thus began one of history's most sinister psychological experiments, the systematic indoctrination of childhood. In 1933, just weeks after taking power, the regime replaced Germany's free youth groups with the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth. Membership was first encouraged, then required. For boys and girls alike, loyalty to the Führer became more sacred than loyalty to family. Every schoolyard became a small training ground in faith and fear. Textbooks were rewritten to erase complexity and doubt. Mathematics problems used bullets instead of apples. If one gun fires 60 rounds in a minute. Biology classes taught racial hierarchy as science. History lessons ended not with reason, but with myth, portraying Hitler as the fulfillment of Germany's destiny. Teachers who resisted were dismissed or imprisoned. Children who questioned were isolated. Within a few years, the classroom had ceased to be a place of learning and had become an assembly line of belief. The indoctrination reached beyond words. Uniforms, marches, and songs turned ideology into emotion. Boys hiked in formation, shouted slogans, and learned to shoot rifles. Girls learned obedience, purity, and the sacred duty of motherhood. Even playtime was political. War games and chants that replaced imagination with conformity. What made this system so psychologically powerful was that it disguised submission as belonging. Children found purpose, friendship, and identity in the uniform they wore. Many came from broken homes or poverty. The Hitler Youth gave them what post-war Germany had taken away: structure, community, and pride. By the time they turned 15, they could no longer separate their self-worth from their service to Hitler. Parents were often powerless. Some feared speaking against the regime in front of their own children, who might report them to party officials. The Nazis called it Kinderpflicht, the duty of the child to protect the state. In a grotesque twist of morality, love of the Führer became proof of patriotism. By the late 1930s, entire generations had grown up without another reference point. Their lullabies were propaganda songs. Their prayers ended with "Heil Hitler." When war came, those same children marched willingly to the front, convinced they were fighting for something pure. This was perhaps Hitler's most chilling psychological trick, transforming innocence into ideology. He didn't need to terrorize these children. He only needed to raise them in a world where tyranny felt like love. Fact 7. The control of reality. Hitler's most enduring weapon was not the army or the secret police. It was the control of truth itself. He discovered that if you could shape what people saw and heard every day, you no longer needed to force them to obey. They would obey willingly because their entire sense of reality would belong to you. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, the first building they occupied wasn't a military fortress. It was the Ministry of Propaganda. Inside those walls, Joseph Goebbels orchestrated one of the most ambitious psychological experiments in modern history: the total colonization of perception. Newspapers, films, radio broadcasts, even theater and art, all were placed under strict control. From dawn until night, the German citizen would be surrounded by a single voice, repeating a single version of truth. Censorship wasn't presented as repression, but as protection. The new regime claimed to shield citizens from lies of the foreign press and moral corruption. But what they were truly protecting was their monopoly on meaning. A banned book wasn't just dangerous. It was evidence that an alternative reality existed somewhere beyond the flames of the bonfire. By erasing it, They erased the idea that there could be another world at all. Films became dreamlike extensions of that illusion. Directors were ordered to fill screens with idealized visions of German life, healthy families, noble soldiers, pure landscapes untouched by decay. The world outside Germany's borders, meanwhile, was shown as diseased, chaotic, and parasitic. Radio, the new technological miracle of the 1930s, was turned into a sacred instrument of propaganda. Cheap people's receivers were distributed to homes so everyone could hear the Führer's voice, not as one opinion among many, but as the only voice that mattered. This was psychological conditioning on a national scale. Every day, repetition hardened illusion into reality. News about military victories was broadcast long after defeats. Casualties were minimized. Atrocities were hidden behind euphemisms. Deportations became resettlements. Massacres, special actions. By corrupting language itself, the regime created a world where truth had no fixed shape, only what the Führer declared it to be. Over time, even those who doubted began to live inside the illusion. It was safer that way. In a country where truth could be fatal, silence became self-defense. People repeated lies not because they believed them, but because they no longer knew how to separate belief from survival. This was Hitler's psychological masterpiece, not just commanding people's actions, but occupying their perception of the world. He didn't merely silence opposition, he rewrote existence. And when reality itself becomes propaganda, even conscience begins to sound like treason. Fact 8. The seduction of order. To understand how Hitler captured the German soul, you must understand his obsession with order. Not moral order, not justice, but visual, emotional, and psychological order. In the chaos of the 1920s, Germany was a nation drowning in confusion. Unemployment, street clashes, political riots, everything felt uncertain. Hitler's brilliance was to take that collective anxiety and turn it into beauty. He made obedience look elegant. When people saw the Nazi rallies, they didn't see politics. They saw perfection. Endless columns of men, identical uniforms, flags rising in perfect rhythm, drums beating like a single heart. The spectacle was mesmerizing. No one was out of place. No sound was unplanned. Even the angles of banners were measured to evoke symmetry. To the human mind, trained to find comfort in patterns, this visual unity felt like peace. After years of disorder, Hitler offered not freedom, but the illusion of harmony. This was the essence of what psychologists now call aesthetic control, using beauty to mask brutality. The swastika itself was designed for that purpose. Its geometry suggested movement, strength, destiny. Its red background signaled passion, its white circle purity. It was propaganda hidden in design. The same logic applied to the uniforms. Black for the SS, symbolizing power and fear. Brown for the stormtroopers, evoking the earth and the people's struggle. Every detail served the same message. Chaos is weakness, uniformity is salvation. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, turned cities into temples of symmetry. Streets were widened for parades. Buildings loomed in mathematical precision. Light and stone replaced reason and conscience. Even sound was choreographed. Speeches timed to the rise of music, footsteps echoing through marble halls, the synchronized cheers of crowds creating the illusion of eternal unity. For ordinary citizens, this order was intoxicating. It gave meaning to small lives. A factory worker who once felt invisible could now stand in a square with 30,000 others, saluting in perfect unison, feeling part of something vast and unshakable. It was no longer important what they believed, only that they belonged. This was the quiet magic of fascism. It replaced thought with pattern and guilt with beauty. In that symmetry, people felt safety. They didn't see the brutality behind the order, the broken bones, the burned books, the silenced screams. They saw flags in the wind, faces lit by torchlight, and believed they were witnessing destiny. Hitler didn't conquer Germany through fear alone. He conquered it through aesthetics, by turning tyranny into art. Fact 9. the promise of greatness. No lie Hitler told was more seductive than this one, that every German was born chosen, destined to restore a fallen empire. After years of humiliation under the Treaty of Versailles, the nation longed not just for bread or stability, but for dignity. Hitler didn't feed the body first, he fed the ego. He gave the broken a crown and called it destiny. The genius of his manipulation was that he didn't promise personal success, he promised collective glory. To the unemployed man, the disgraced soldier, the humiliated citizen, he whispered, "You are not alone in your failure. You are part of a people robbed of its greatness." And in that moment, pain turned to pride. Shame found purpose. The crowd that once bowed its head now lifted it high, convinced that their suffering had meaning. Every speech was built on this psychological conversion, from despair to superiority. Hitler's rhetoric followed a rhythm. First, he described Germany's wounds in vivid detail. Then he offered a villain to blame. Finally, he promised redemption through unity and strength. The story was religious in structure: sin, enemy, salvation. Millions accepted it because it gave emotional coherence to their chaos. He spoke not as a politician, but as a redeemer. "I will make you proud again," he thundered. "I will return to you what was stolen." Each word was calibrated to dissolve individuality into collective destiny. "You are not small," he told them. "You are the heirs of greatness." For a people stripped of identity, that belief was irresistible. Propaganda films and posters deepened the illusion. They showed farmers, smiling in golden fields, workers forging steel, mothers cradling blonde children, the visual gospel of a perfect race reborn. The imagery was designed to erase reality. Poverty was hidden behind painted smiles, division disguised as unity. Every German who saw those images felt elevated, needed, part of something pure. And with that came the most dangerous psychological transformation of all: moral immunity. Once convinced of their own greatness, people stopped questioning what that greatness cost. If others had to suffer for Germany's renewal, so be it. It was fate. That belief turned ordinary citizens into silent collaborators and cruelty into duty. This was Hitler's ultimate emotional exchange. He took humiliation and sold it back as pride. The Germans didn't rise from despair. They were lifted by illusion. He made them believe they were the victors of history long before the first shot was fired. And when defeat finally came, it was not just the nation that collapsed. It was the identity he had built within them. Fact 10. The psychology of fear. If pride was the glue that bound Germany to Hitler, fear was the chain that kept it there. After he rose to power, Hitler's propaganda no longer needed to persuade. It needed to control. Hope had done its work. Now terror would preserve it. What began as a movement of passion turned into a system of silence. The first victims were not Jews or foreigners, but Germans themselves. Within weeks of taking office in 1933, the Gestapo, the secret state police, was born. Its purpose was not simply to punish dissent, but to create the illusion that dissent was everywhere. People were told, "The Führer's eyes see all." That phrase spread like wildfire through neighborhoods, factories, schools. It didn't matter that the Gestapo had limited staff. What mattered was that no one knew who might be listening. Fear became invisible and omnipresent. A neighbor's knock could mean death. A careless joke could end in a cell. Parents whispered at night so their children wouldn't overhear and repeat their words at school. Over time, silence itself became a form of communication. The quiet nod, the cautious glance, the pause before speaking. It was a nation collectively learning to hold its breath. The genius of this terror was that it required very little violence to sustain it. People began policing themselves. They censored their own thoughts, avoided certain books, changed topics mid-sentence. Goebbels called it self-regulating obedience. It was psychological slavery disguised as patriotism. When arrests did occur, they were spectacular and public. Newspapers printed photographs of traitors dragged through the streets. The message was clear: One wrong sentence could erase an entire life. For every person actually punished, hundreds learned the lesson without needing to see blood. The absence of justice was the point. Fear thrives on uncertainty. Even the most loyal Germans lived under this shadow. Party officials could fall overnight, condemned by rumors or rivals. The same system that devoured its enemies also consumed its servants. That instability kept everyone loyal, not out of love, but out of terror that they might be next. Psychologists later described this as conditioned anxiety, a state where people conform not because they believe, but because they've forgotten what safety feels like without conformity. The regime had fused fear with identity. Obedience was no longer a choice, it was survival. By 1939, an entire nation moved in quiet synchrony, not from faith, but from dread. The cheers at rallies sounded thunderous, but underneath was the silence of millions afraid to stop clapping first. Hitler ruled not just through violence, but through the psychological architecture of fear, a system where every citizen became both prisoner and guard. Fact 11. The collapse of conscience. There was a time when most Germans could still tell right from wrong. But under Hitler, that inner compass, the quiet human voice that whispers, "This is wrong," began to fade. Not through violence alone, but through gradual corrosion. A moral numbness that spread one decision at a time until silence felt safer than truth. The trick was simple, devastating, and slow. Hitler didn't ask people to become monsters overnight. He asked them to take small steps, sign a paper, report a neighbor, look away when a Jewish shop was vandalized. Each act seemed harmless in isolation, justified by fear, patriotism, or necessity. But each one chipped away at conscience until obedience felt virtuous and doubt felt dangerous. Propaganda did the rest. The regime flooded everyday life with messages that redefined morality itself. Compassion became weakness. Mercy became betrayal. To love your nation meant to hate its enemies, whoever the state decided they were that week. Children in classrooms repeated slogans like prayers, "The Führer is always right." When truth becomes a matter of loyalty, conscience becomes irrelevant. The transformation was so complete that even good people began to speak the language of cruelty. Doctors justified euthanasia programs as mercy killings. Bureaucrats referred to deportations as special relocations. Soldiers described massacres as operations. Words stripped away guilt. Language became anesthesia for the soul. In diaries recovered after the war, ordinary Germans revealed how easily they rationalized their complicity. One railway worker wrote, "I only operated the trains. I never saw what happened at the other end." A teacher confessed, "We didn't ask where the Jewish children went. We told ourselves it wasn't our business." These were not villains. They were people who had learned to survive by not feeling. The true power of Hitler's psychology wasn't just fear, it was moral inversion. He didn't only break laws, he rewired values. Under his regime, obedience was purity, questioning was treason, and pity was sin. Once those ideas settled into the heart, conscience ceased to exist. By the time the camps were operating at full capacity, the machinery of genocide ran smoothly, not because millions loved evil, but because millions no longer recognized it. The greatest horror of Nazi Germany wasn't that so many followed orders. It was that so few remembered how not to. When conscience collapses, evil doesn't need to scream. It only needs silence. And Hitler mastered that silence. Fact 12. The Last Illusion. April 1945. The Third Reich was ashes, Berlin was burning, and the once immortal Führer hid in an underground bunker, surrounded by ruins. Yet even then, his final and most haunting psychological trick endured: the illusion of destiny. He had convinced millions that Germany's fate and his own were the same, that to doubt him was to doubt the nation itself. Even as the walls shook from Soviet artillery, he still spoke of victory. The men and women who had followed him for more than a decade refused to believe the truth. Newspapers still printed miracle weapon stories. Radio broadcasts spoke of phantom divisions ready to strike. Hitler's voice, trembling, weaker now, told them to hold firm. He no longer promised triumph, he promised immortality through sacrifice. "If Germany falls," he declared, "she is unworthy of me." It was no longer leadership. It was suicide disguised as faith. Psychologically, it was the final stage of mass delusion, when reality collapses and people cling to lies because truth is unbearable. Soldiers on the front still wrote letters swearing loyalty. Families in bombed cities said prayers for Hitler's salvation. Even as defeat became undeniable, many Germans chose to interpret ruin as purification, a test from fate. Hitler had not only ruled their minds, he had colonized their sense of meaning. Inside the bunker, his closest followers mirrored the same hypnosis. They called him Mein Führer until the last hour. When he ordered them to burn his body, they obeyed without hesitation. That was the measure of his control, obedience that survived the end of the world. And when he finally shot himself on April 30th, 1945, he left behind not just a destroyed nation, but a poisoned psychology, a generation conditioned to see catastrophe as destiny and fanaticism as faith. The bombs had ended his empire, but the illusion lingered, whispering through the rubble. It was not our fault. It was fate. That was Hitler's last victory, to make his followers mistake destruction for devotion. In the end, Hitler's power wasn't born in battlefields or speeches. It lived inside the human mind. He didn't just conquer a nation. He redefined reality for millions, teaching them to trade conscience for comfort, truth for belonging. His story is not only a warning from the past, it is a mirror. Because the tools he used, fear, repetition, pride, illusion, are not gone. They wait quietly for the next voice that learns how to use them.